D, quote-unquote, motivation. A certain philosophy was implied when intellectualism took up the naturalistic notion of sensation. Reciprocally, when psychology definitively eliminates this notion, we can expect to find in this reformulation the beginnings of a new type of reflection. At the level of psychology, the critique of the constancy hypothesis merely signifies that judgment is abandoned as an explanatory factor in the theory of perception. How could we claim that the perception of distance is derived from the apparent size of objects, from the disparity of the retinal images, from the adaptation of the lens, or from the convergence of the eyes? And how could we claim that the perception of depth is derived from the difference between the images provided by the right eye and left eye, respectively, since, if we hold ourselves to the phenomena, not one of these signs is clearly given to consciousness, and since there can be no reasoning where premises are lacking? But this critique of intellectualism only touches upon its popularization among psychologists, and like intellectualism itself, this popularization must be transported to the level of reflection, where the philosopher no longer seeks to explain perception, but rather to coincide with the perceptual operation and to understand it. On this level, the critique of the constancy hypothesis reveals that perception is not an act of the understanding. I need only look at an upside-down landscape in order to no longer recognize anything there. For the understanding, up and down have but a relative sense, and the understanding could not encounter the orientation of the landscape as if encountering an absolute obstacle. In front of the understanding, a square is always a square, whether it rests on one of its sides or on one of its corners. In the latter case, however, perception hardly even recognizes the square. The paradox of symmetrical objects confronts the logicism with the originality of perceptual experience. This idea must again be taken up and generalized. There is a perceived signification that has no equivalent in the universe of the understanding, a perceptual milieu that is not yet the objective world, and a perceptual being that is not yet determinate being. It is just that the psychologists who practice the description of phenomena are normally unaware of the philosophical weight of their method. They do not see that the return to perceptual experience, if this reformulation is consistent and radical, condemns all forms of realism, that is, all philosophies that leave consciousness behind and take as given one of its results. They do not see that intellectualism's true flaw is precisely in having taken a determinate universe of science as given, that this criticism applies a fortiori to psychological thought, since it places perceptual consciousness in the midst of a ready-made world, or that the critique of the constancy hypothesis, if carried to its conclusion, takes on the value of a true phenomenological reduction. Gestalt theory has, of course, shown that the supposed signs of distance, the object's apparent size, the number of objects interposed between us and the object in question, the disparity of retinal images, and the degree of accommodation and convergence are only explicitly known in an analytical or reflective perception that turns away from the object itself and rather bears upon the object's mode of presentation, and thus we do not pass through the intermediaries in order to know distance. It's just that Gestalt theory concludes from this that since the bodily impressions or the interposed objects of the field are not signs or reasons in our perception or distance, they can only be causes of this perception. They thereby return to an explanatory psychology whose ideal Gestalt theory never abandoned, because, like psychology, it never broke with naturalism. But in the same stroke, Gestalt theory betrays its own descriptions. A subject whose oculomotor muscles are paralyzed sees the objects move toward the left when he believes himself to be turning his eyes toward the left. Classical psychology explains that perception reasons as follows. The eye is assumed to be swinging toward the left, and yet, since the retinal images have not moved, the landscape must have slid toward the left such that the images maintain their place upon the eye. Gestalt theory makes it clear that the perception of the position of the objects does not pass through the detour of an express consciousness of the body. I do not know at any moment that the images have remained immobile upon my retina. Rather, I immediately see the landscape move towards the left. But consciousness does not restrict itself to receiving a ready-made illusory phenomenon to be produced. A ready-made illusory phenomenon produced outside of itself by some physiological causes. For the illusion to be produced, the subject must have had the intention of looking toward the left and must have thought he was moving his eyes. The illusion with regard to one's own body brings with it the appearance of movement in the object. The movement of one's own body are naturally invested with a certain perceptual signification. They form a system with external phenomena so tightly woven that external perception takes account of the movements of the perceptual organs, and it finds in them, if not the explicit explanation, then at least the motive for the intervening changes in the spectacle, and can thereby understand these changes immediately. When I have the intention of looking to the left, the movement of the gaze quite naturally translates as an oscillation of the visual field. The objects remain in place, but only after a momentary vibration. This consequence is not learned. It is a part of the natural arrangements of the psychophysical subject. It is, we will see, an annex of our body schema and the immanent signification of a movement of the gaze. When it happens to be missing, when we are conscious of moving our eyes without the spectacle being affected by this movement, this phenomenon finds expression, without any explicit deduction, in an apparent movement of the object toward the left. The gaze and the landscape remain as if glued to each other. No sudden twitching dissociates them. The gaze and its illusory movement brings along with it the landscape, and the sliding of the landscape is ultimately nothing other than its fixity at the end of a gaze that is believed to be in movement. Thus, the immobility of the images upon the retina and the paralysis of the oculomotor muscles are not objective causes that determine the illusion and carry it ready-made into consciousness. The intention to move the eye and the docility of the landscape to this movement are not, moreover, the premises or the reasons for the illusion, but they are its motives. In the same manner, objects interposed between me and the one I am focusing upon are not perceived for themselves, but they are nevertheless perceived, and we have no reason to deny this marginal perception a role in the vision of distance, since the apparent distance shrinks the moment a screen hides the interposed objects. The objects that fill the field do not act on the apparent distance like a cause on its effect. When the screen is moved aside, we see the distance being borne from the interposed objects. This is the silent language perception speaks to us. The interposed objects, in this natural text, mean a larger distance. It is nevertheless not a question of the logic of constituted truth, one of the connections that objective logic knows, for there is no reason for the bell tower to appear to me as smaller and farther away the moment that I can see more clearly the details of the hills and the fields that separate me from it. There is no reason, but there is a motive.